G'day there, I'm David Krantz. This is part one of a new series where I'm exploring stuff to get answers that throw light on life's curly questions. Things like, where did I really come from? What are we here for? Are we here by chance or by intent? Where does God fit in it all? And indeed, where do I fit? Well, there's no other place to start than at the beginning. I've considered both scientific and theological views only to wind up with the conclusion that the universe itself has made its mind up that we are a critical part of its continuing evolutionary story. Some steps leading to that conclusion introduce terms and processes that may be unfamiliar. But please, don't bother about the detail. Getting the broad gist of the ideas is sufficient to follow the thrust of my exploration. The implications of my conclusion signal a new beginning for me. They empower me to live out my time with more effective loving intent than I've managed to muster in all my 88 years to date. I hope that there's something in it all that might perhaps fill a blank or two for you as well. There seems to be a general acceptance that it all kicked off with the Big Bang, but not so, says astrophysicist Paul Sutter. The Big Bang theory is not a theory of the creation of the universe. It's a model of its history. He puts it like this. In the beginning, there was a question mark. All else followed. The end. All a bit crisp, don't you think? It's clear that if we assume a beginning, then anything that emerges after that beginning could have been no more than a possibility before that beginning. If that's so, it's my punt that the question that Sutter avoids could read, how do possibilities turn into actual stuff? I guess that I'm not alone in realizing that before I can create anything, I need to see its possibility in my mind's eye before I start. If that process is a general principle, it's reasonable to suppose that some mind or other first saw the possibility of an evolving universe and then created it. For countless millions, that mind is their particular God, a deity worshipped in different ways that honour particular practices moulded from different sacred texts. Then comes the clincher. Is there a singular creative mind behind such deities? Before sifting the pros and cons of that possibility, let's look at Sutter's summary of what followed, before looking at other proposals of possible beginnings. Here's Sutter's quote. At one time, the entire universe, everything you know and love, everything on earth and in heaven, was crushed into a trillion Kelvin ball that was about the size of a peach. Now, a trillion kelvins is hot. If you do the maths, it equals this mouthful of degrees centigrade. At peach size, the universe was 10 to the minus 36th of a second old. And I love his closing quip, or thereabouts. Just before that snapshot, Sutter's metaphoric peach was smaller and hotter. It was a microscopic so-called singularity that somehow mysteriously housed the germinal everything as a possible complexity. Without saying how, the singularity exploded. The Big Bang unfurled the ingredients of everything, including time, that melded with emerging space. But hang on a minute, there's a problem. My mind tells me that if time was created with the Big Bang, it's irrational to speak of even a possibility existing before the time that wasn't there yet. So, as weird as it may sound, it seems fair to conclude that the possibility must have existed outside of time and space. Well before human consciousness emerged, there has been tangible stuff in both time and space since the beginning. And there are still infinite possibilities outside time and space awaiting birth. Such is the evolutionary process. So let's fast forward to our now and map the scientific stepping stones that shape our understanding of what it's all about. Here we are, some 13.8 billion years on, give or take a year or two, as descendants of that first event. We are somewhere on the big ball bottom right, hopefully enjoying everything we know and love, and take for granted, mostly without a thought of its evolution from the mystical singularity that blew up on the year dot. For starters, credit must be given to Stephen Hawking, then a research fellow at Cambridge, and Roger Penrose, now Emeritus Professor of Mathematics, Oxford, who between 1968 and 70 looked at Hubble's earlier finding of an expanding universe. Then they worked his maths backwards to calculate how long it would take to contract to a pinpoint. This is the gist of their singularity theorems that proposed that the universe grew from that point of infinite density, the flashpoint of the Big Bang. It was their story that Sutter outlined earlier. Their maths cross-checked with the 1964 discovery of the cosmic microwave background noise that permeates space. Here's a sample of light released just 380,000 years after the Big Bang. The evidence seemed to support the Big Bang theory, but a number of scientists rejected it and have generated models to support their claim that the universe has always existed. And I still want to know whether a mind of some kind or other is somehow involved. Physicist Sean Carroll has outlined a couple of speculations to support the claim of a perpetual universe. The first model, a bouncing universe, was introduced in the 1960s. It proposes that another universe collapsed inwards into a point of infinite gravity. That's another singularity. And then, boing, bounced back to produce our own universe. In the 1980s, the model was enhanced by the suggestion that there could be even a kind of accordion effect, expanding and contracting cycles full of big bangs. Now, even though Stephen Hawking had previously shown that the notion of a bouncing universe violated Einstein's general theory of relativity, the proponents simply argued that, well, as yet, current theories are incomplete. Not very persuasive, I think. Again, in the 1980s, the multiverse model suggests that before the Big Bang, there was nothing but inflating space from which other universes emerged, including ours. To remedy some of the theoretical problems of the previous models, its supporters called on a notion from quantum mechanics that says that tiny random fluctuations of energy occur in space. They suggested that any peak of such energy could magnify, take form, and pop out of the parent universe, rather like Jason Torshinsky's image here. According to Carroll, the idea of inflation is fairly well accepted, but the model itself does not fully convince. The theorizing continues. Some 14 years after his work with Penrose on the description of the Big Bang, Hawking teamed up with James Hartle, professor of physics at the University of California, to look at what might have gone on prior to the Big Bang. Their mathematical revisions introduced the notion of imaginary time, which makes it easier to understand a pre-bang beginning in terms of the laws of science. Here's how Hawking put it, and I quote, "The picture Jim Hartle and I developed of the spontaneous creation of the universe would be a bit like the formation of bubbles of steam in boiling water. It's a metaphor where some bubbles would appear, then disappear, and others would appear and continue to inflate into a universe that would emerge at the Big Bang." Unquote. Now, whilst the theoretical aspects continued to be more refined, they also continued to be rigorously debated. Sir Roger Penrose joined the debate at a conference in March 2013, where he highlighted the inadequacy of entrenched assumptions behind such debates. His topic was the quantum nature of consciousness. He reminded participants of the current view that consciousness arises from complex applications of some complicated calculations, and then pointed out that in the quantum world there are events that occur outside of those complex computational laws of physics. He pointed out that to understand anything, we must be aware of it. To be aware of it requires consciousness. He asserted that the act of invoking consciousness is beyond the computational tasks of physics, and that there must be a quantum ceiling yet to be fully explored. My lay understanding sees this exploration as happening in two schools. The science about consciousness that assumes that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a sort of byproduct of the brain, and seeks its answers in chemical and neurological terms. The new science within consciousness identifies its universality that inevitably includes brain consciousness. This difference is profound. Conventional science sees matter as the ground of all being. The science within consciousness asserts that consciousness is the ground of all being. Now, matter cannot create non-matter, like ideas and thoughts. Conventional research can track the impact of thoughts in the brain, of course, but not their source. Consciousness creates both matter and non-matter. Dr. Amit Goswami, Emeritus Professor of Physics from Oregon University, was a pioneer in researching the new science within consciousness. Here are some broad gleanings from his work. The nature of consciousness is that it is aware. It knows itself. It has a mind. It is mind. It is mindful. Mindful of its benevolence to all creation, and of its organizing competence, and its absolute intelligence. It is wise and generous with it. Its presence is everywhere and every when. It is outside space and time in so-called transcendent reality. It's also in the here and now, in the physical world of stuff, in the so-called immanent reality. Both are nesting in unified consciousness. As such, and above all, it's the creative source of all that is. And guess how it does it? It turns possibilities into stuff, both material and non-material stuff. To get an idea of how that works, let's chart the bits and pieces. Here's a simple representation of consciousness, the aware mind that is the ground of all being, the total oneness that Goswami subtitles the mind of God. We'll see why later on. It houses two realities. We live in immanent reality, the domain of specific things, places and clocks. We dwell in so-called space-time. The second reality is called the transcendent reality. It is boundless in space and eternal in time. It's said to be outside space-time. It houses possibilities. Now, every actual thing or thought that we can sense down here was just one of an infinite number of possibilities here in transcendent reality, waiting to get the nod, so to speak, to manifest, so-called, here in immanent reality. So who gives the nod? How does it work? Simply put, consciousness gives the nod. It goes a bit like this. Possibilities are waves of encoded energy that dance about in transcendence until consciousness chooses that it's advantageous for a particular possibility to manifest. The choosing is said to be by observation, a bit like consciousness seeing the need or opportunity to manifest a particular possibility in its mind's eye, so to speak. And bingo, job done. Note that the possibility stays on the universal dance floor in case it's wanted later on. Here's the principle. Non-material possibilities collapse, so-called, to manifest as actual things when intentionally observed by consciousness. And that includes our consciousness in given circumstances. Let's now put us in the equation. Here in immanent space-time, we all have a brain. It's made of matter. Big C consciousness created it for us to be aware of our own little c consciousness. The two are always linked. However, our awareness of the connection switches off from time to time, like when we've got a problem that we can't yet solve, for instance. Now, Big C conscious mind is fully aware of the context and bits and pieces of our problem. Mind goes to work on our behalf in so-called unconscious processing. In that process, mind's intelligence sees a range of possible solutions to our problem. Its wisdom checks the solutions for fit. Its organising skills ensure that solutions are manageable. Mind has cobbled a short list of really good possible options that we can represent as this red dot. Now, mind's benevolence loves to help, but it's not pushy. It respects our freedom to choose. It's got a nifty way of presenting the options that are a bit spooky. Without us knowing, a so-called representation of the possibility appears in our brain non-locally, which means that it neither actually travelled nor used energy to get there. It'll hang about for as long as our little c awareness is busily preoccupied with our problem. Perhaps in a quiet moment, but certainly when we intentionally invite our mind to resonate with Big C, universal mind, our mind will recognise its oneness and then see the representation of the possible options. We can then choose the option that looks just right for us, and we experience an aha moment. And not too far later, our mind starts to think about how to implement the solution. Little c resonance is then again masked. Now, if asked, we might tell an interested friend that the solution just came to me, out of the blue, kind of speak. Consciousness does the solving, and we do the resolving. I've had a bit of a layman's search for what might be behind Sutter's question mark. The chase has led me to what seems to be the unanswered fundamental question. How does observing a possibility collapse it into a reality? Over the 13 billion years since the Big Bang, there has been an evolving progression of collapsing possibilities that have manifested into actualities of greater complexity and beauty, in kinship with examples like this. And this. Let's view our habitat through the eyes of scattered tribesfolk from some 60,000 years ago. We experience nature's moods, its beauty and its ugliness, its ferocity and peacefulness, the lean times and the fruitful, the flow of seasons and of lifespans, the magnitude, the mystery, the terror and the awe, the potency beyond the self with which we somehow feel connected. Each tribe in its place has crafted its own creation story. There are tribal names aplenty for consciousness itself. Let's look at some of them. The stories seem to flow in 3 separate streams. In stream 1, stories from these sources seem to have been launched from some sort of tangible pre-existing platform within the universe, like the Chinese egg-shaped cloud, for instance. The stream 2 stories each nominate a deity as the creative source. For example, many Westerners are aware of the Creator God from the Hebrew stories. For me, stream 3 is more like a single lagoon of deeper insight. It seems to capture the story of the birth of Creator Brahma in these terms. From absolute nothingness came this thought: let me have a self. And thought created mind. Mind, the very essence of the creative consciousness that Goswami insists is the ground of all being. The creative stories arose in different cultural and geographic contexts that shaped the meaning ascribed to the mystery, the magnificence, and the magnetism that attracted a sense of connectedness with the big out there. For those in my Stream 2 stories, the out there was both adored and feared in here, in both heart and mind. The experience spawned faith relations between a God in heaven, up there, by whatever name, and us down here on earth. We are separate, however intimate the experience might feel. The relationship is dualistic. Recall Brahma's story where thought created mind. Amit Goswami's Hindu background taught him that the mind of Brahman was the sole cause for the universe. But later, as a scientific skeptic, he dropped that belief. And now, in the light of his later pioneering research into consciousness, it's not hard to fathom why he now subtitles consciousness as the mind of God, whose monistic perspective is that all reality is a single entity, that all that is interconnected in a network of oneness. It seems to me that we may no longer need to seek visitations from a dualistic God as the love source, when the monistic mind of God proclaims that we are a love source within the love source, consciousness. Let me share my discomfort with such dualism and the advantage of adopting the monistic alternative. This is the God that I grew up with. I learned that he was up there and I was down here. We were separated. I heard all the Bible stories and became a committed teenage Christian and somehow saw God as pure white light. But I've come to see that separation makes the light flicker. It's on when we're in touch and off for the rest of the time. In our off times, the light of God is diffused through the prism of our egos and the filters of our history. Notice that the integrity of the spectrum has somehow been diluted. Collectively, with dilute separation, diminished perception, and evolving theologies, our histories have coloured and configured different faith traditions that could be represented like this. The outcome is that different groups emphasise particular aspects of belief to define their identity and sadly highlight their separateness. Yet each faith group is likely to claim that they represent the true light. Some groups seek interfaith cooperation, mutual understanding and even union in some cases, but others remain aloof. Some actively follow hatred. A minority has become warlike. Dualism fosters dualism. I can see this tendency to fight giving way to collaboration if we intentionally and progressively reframe the diverse dualistic God stuff into the monistic mind of God stuff. It's worth repeating that whilst we are always nested in the mind of God, we are not always aware of it. Our egos mask that awareness at times when we are preoccupied with making sense of day-to-day stuff. However, in the unmasked mindset, separation thaws, and the integrity of true light will be perceived more accurately from whichever orientation it's viewed. When we intentionally focus on the mind of God, the mask fades, and we can experience resonance between our mind, little c consciousness, and universal mind, big C consciousness, the mind of God. It's from this union that we can gain new insights, resolve uncertainties, and see better ways of expressing the fruitfulness of what mind intuitively reveals to us. Tuition from within. In short, we learn to be more effective in the ways we choose to live the truth in love. So what, in practical terms, are the key differences between a dualistic God and monistic consciousness, alias the mind of God? Let's chart them. Here again is consciousness, the all-knowing mind that saw the possibility of an evolving universe and gave birth to its unfurling of all that is. And in the master plan, on a tiny planet, is a habitat of beauty for the teeming life that pinnacles in emerging humanity. It too, with a measure of mind, to sense its oneness with its source. The link is substantial. Dr. Jude Currivan, cosmologist, planetary healer and futurist, says this, and I quote, "The latest scientific evidence is revealing that our universe is a cosmic hologram that exists and evolves as a unified and finite thought form in the infinite mind of the cosmos." Unquote. The fact that each part of a hologram contains the whole means that, as a constituent part, each of us can access the wisdom of the universe as a natural birthright. I've coloured consciousness purple, the traditional symbolic colour of divinity. Its dynamic is love. It recognises nothing but truth. It deems all else to be illusion. The blend of love and truth underpin divinity. Our tribal ancestors saw the handiwork of consciousness through different coloured eyes. They sensed a connectedness to it, infused with both awe and fear. They wondered who the architect might be, and fabricated stories of gods that filled each cultural void. At its core, their new god took on the divinity to which they now felt connected, the purple bit. It was this presence that now aroused both awe and fear. The coloured peripheries reflect the limitations and differences of the cultural story. None captured the fullness of consciousness. Each story spawned different religious practices that are still evolving from their colourful starts. Recall the Hebrew creation story that set its first family in a perfect garden. How awesome! In the same story, its primitive god then threatened banishment if they dared to hunger for knowledge. How fearful! We are still evolving. We've grown. We no longer fear our quest for knowing. In fact, it's the current knowledge of consciousness itself that makes it possible for us to compare the difference between how we relate to our particular God and consciousness in terms of intimacy, status, interaction, integrity, and contribution. Let's use Goswami's alias, the mind of God, in making the comparisons. In terms of intimacy, our relationship with God is dualistic. We're separated. We invite God's visitation down. We petition up for God's benevolence. Contact is intermittent. Our intimacy with the mind of God is monistic. Recall that monism is defined as the theory of reality as a single entity. As such, we are at one in ever-present consciousness. Contact only becomes spasmodic when our busy egos tend to mask that awareness. The status of the relationship with God is that it is still evolving. It has to. There are residual woolly peripheries that still require definition. The status of the mind of God, however, is enduring. There are no loose ends that need defining. It's all together. The purple periphery simply reminds us that there are still possibilities yet to manifest with evolutionary progress, including the unfolding of the mystery of how possibilities manifest as actualities. It's this difference in status that influences the nature of human interaction. The defining and refining of our understanding of God still continues. Human forums argue over woolly definitions. It's competitive. Hot debates formulate new theologies and modify old theologies, and then adapt rituals to match. Human history is littered with nasty divisions both between and within faith groups. In contrast, our interaction with mind is collaborative. We share the job of continuing the evolutionary thrust. By choosing to engage, we can co-create and open ourselves to new insights and possibilities. Consciousness may beckon our collaboration, but does not coerce. It's our choice. We don't get judged if we back off. We just don't grow. Nor is the universe enriched. There is integrity within the mind of God. There is a constancy that harmonizes. On the other hand, the variable options that competitive theologies offer diminish the integrity of what constitutes God's will. This difference may impact on any contribution that we may be contemplating, in terms of both the wisdom of the project and of our confidence for its implementation. Here, a period of discernment may be prayerfully undertaken with the help of a spiritual advisor or not. Here, by intention, one can determine what's best, either by accurate intuition or by an accurate, simple truth test, yet to be described in due course. But for now, let's consider a practical example. Let's say that we compare the effectiveness of the healing of a sick friend by either prayer or by intention. When we pray, our relationship with God is not only dualistic, God's up and we're down, but also hierarchical. God is powerful and we are dependent. We therefore seek God's help in prayer. We leave the work to God and await the outcome, God's pleasure, so to speak. On the other hand, our relationship with the mind of God is collaborative and interactive. We share the work and expect the intended outcome. Now, in both instances, the helper's mindset will influence the outcomes in one way or the other. For example, a belief in a God that loves unconditionally will foster a hopeful mindset towards prayer, whereas seeing God as judgmental might raise some doubts about the outcome. It's a bit like that with intention. Outcome is linked to the level of trust one has in the power of love. Ideally, the collective mindset holds the certainty that love is power. Intenders hold that love empowers. Beneficiaries anticipate that love heals. Later on, we'll look at a table that shows how these outcomes vary at different levels of consciousness. There's yet another aspect of mindset to take into account. It's what Neil Walsh calls the sponsoring thought. In his book, Conversations with God, Walsh defines the sponsoring thought as the thought behind the thought, and argues that sponsoring thoughts become our reality. Now, if that's so, any doubtful thoughts about our friend's recovery might mean that our friend stays sick. Perhaps even the inherent tentativeness in the traditional plea, "Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer," may translate as a negative sponsoring thought. To offset that possibility, Walsh encourages us to envisage a positive outcome when we pray. For example, if a child is sick, see it playing its favourite game in your mind's eye. In an evolutionary sense, that idea aligns with the approach that by intention we aim to envisage the most beneficial possible outcome in the belief that it will manifest as actuality. Now, there are times when we are tentative about what the best intention is, but we can easily check it out with a simple truth test, to be overviewed later. It's my view that the constancy inherent in helping others by monistic intent is preferred to the uncertainty of traditional prayer. I believe that such uncertainties will prevail until all the variable perceptions of God are distilled into verifiable truths about the creative source, by which time God and consciousness, alias mind of God, will have blended into one. Who can tell how long it'll take for entrenched institutional conditioning to embrace liberating truths? I'm in good company in giving intention the tick for being the preferred way of delivering assistance to others. In her book, The Intention Experiment, Lynn McTaggart summarises a global research experiment that validated the intentional approach to healing. She later published The Power of Eight. which she subtitled Harnessing the Miraculous Energies of Small Groups to Heal Others, Your Life and the World. Both are groundbreaking texts. But for now, let's move on and see what this truth testing is all about. Simply but profoundly put, truth is that which emanates from or resonates with the loving mind of God. That which does not resonate with truth is false, or to be more accurate, just simply not true. Resonance is simply being in tune with. If we ding a wine glass and sing the very same note loud enough, the glass will shatter. Resonance creates energy. Truth strengthens and falsity weakens. The truth of these statements permeate the universe. Consciousness reflects that distinction in the muscular systems of its creations. Kinesiologists use a simple muscle testing process as a major diagnostic tool. It works like this. The subject stands with arm outstretched. The tester says, "Resist when I push down on your forearm." This gives them both a sense of the pressure applied. Then a very simple test could be about what day it is. Let's say that it's Saturday. The tester could then invite the subject to resist again, while she says, "Today is Saturday." The arm stays put. Resistance is strong. The statement is true. Resistance is invited again, while the tester says, "Today is Sunday or any other non-Saturday." Simultaneously, the arm drops. The resistance is weak. The statement is false. It's noteworthy that researcher David Hawkins employed this strategy to correlate a range of human factors against calibrated levels of human consciousness, of universal consciousness. The chart is a bit of an eyeful, so a quick overview seems in order. The ascending levels reflect increasing awareness that we are conscious beings. The degree to which we are conscious of consciousness mirrors all aspects of who we are. Let's look at a couple of examples. People who live in a state of constant fear have very little awareness of their link to consciousness. They view life as frightening. Their pervasive emotion is anxiety. Their process, that's what they typically do, is to withdraw from life. Further up the scale, at the level of reason, life is seen as meaningful. At this level of consciousness, the process is abstraction. Bits and pieces are noticed, they're questioned, juggled, and interrelated where possible in order to experience a deeper understanding. Notice the differences in the way that God might be seen. The fearful are likely to see God as punitive, whereas at the level of reason, the meaning ascribed might acknowledge a wisdom source beyond oneself. Each level is calibrated on a logarithmic scale. This means that the increments between levels is not the same. Notice that at the bottom, the gap is a mere 10 points from 20 to 30, whereas between the top levels, the gap is 400, from 600 to 1,000. This reflects how potency expands in increasingly bigger bites in the approach towards enlightenment. The green arrow covers ratings above 200. Hawkins calls this group power. The calibrations below 200 he labels as force. This is a critical distinction. True power just is. It emanates from consciousness itself. Force is movement to overcome friction. Consider the issue of social disturbance, for example. Force treats it with laws, prohibitions, policing, and they in turn can polarize sectors of counterforce. On the other hand, power heals. Love deals with the underlying causes. Consider this, for instance. Hawkers calibrated Gandhi at 760 and the might of the British Empire at 175, and concluded that, and I quote, "Wherever force meets power, force is eventually defeated," unquote. The big question is, how were these calibrations derived? The answer is intriguing. Hawkins simply asked consciousness, and consciousness answered in its own way through subtle energies. The truth or falsity was tested kinesiologically. Subtle energies influence our muscles in ways that signal a distinct yes or no to any statement we may make or to any question that we may ask. If you want to experiment with this kind of testing, your first step is to know how to read both a true and a false response. A foolproof way of ensuring a yes is to ask a question that you know to be true. So let me show you how that works with a simple pendulum and where we can take it from there. Today's reality is that it's Wednesday. Easily verified is today Wednesday. Clockwise rotation, that's a yes. Hang about, is today Saturday. Anti-clockwise rotation, no. Easily determined, always consistent for me in that sense. You will have seen my hand wobble. Let me assure you that I am not doing that. Any movement in my hand is totally involuntary, under the influence of the subtle energies of consciousness. Now, my polarity might not be yours. It could be the other way about. So you'll need to test that for yourself to establish your norms. Now, you mightn't even have a pendulum to do that. Get a cork, get a threaded needle, bang them together, and you've got a pendulum. When you're starting, it doesn't come easily sometimes. You think, oh, I can't do this. It helps if you put your hand underneath the pendulum for a start and then move that lot down in front of your solar plexus, just a bit above your navel. There's an energy field there that you might find helpful. Another point to make is that we can actually influence the outcome sometimes. We've got a yen, I hope to hell it's this. And if we're just above 200 on Hawkins' scale, ego can get in the way. Up at 500 or 600, you're far less likely to be personally influencing those outcomes. There we go. Have a go, find your norm. There's another way that we can proof test this. Put your fingers like this. join them together, give them a jiggle so that they don't break. That's your norm, your strength norm. No, if we say, give us a yes, show me a yes, please, Cosmos, it won't break. Try this. Show me a no. Ha ha. You can't help yourself. The energies weaken your norm. And that is also a pretty interesting way to get a yes and a no. Give it a whirl, see what you reckon. Now, the linear mind finds it hard to accept this kind of truth testing. It's not reasonable. It can't be figured out logically. The linear mind, at its best, helps us to understand our material world by figuring stuff out, seeing what it means, so that we can act appropriately. Any contribution I might make is by what I do. The action is by me. At a higher level of consciousness, in spiritual reality, contribution is through me, my state of being. If I was in the enlightened state, which I'm not, the contribution would be as me. I'd be fully conscious of the consciousness that simply is. Now it follows that those acting at any of these levels have differing capacities to help elevate those whose egos drive them to seek satisfaction by having. Those who need for contribution to flow to them. Now there's a mission, if the cap fits. As an aside, you may wish to visit this link for more detail. Now the reality is that Hawkins was only able to find 4 individuals that calibrated at the top 1,000. Chronologically, they are Krishna, Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus. Each was fully enlightened in their time, and each contributed fully to the evolutionary progress. Now, I'm most familiar with the man Jesus, so I tested a few statements with my pendulum to establish the truth about some of the perspectives that are still debated in the competitive way that we discussed earlier. Here's a sample. There is a distinction between divinity and deity, and Jesus was divine. Jesus is a deity. Jesus modelled the full humanity that we can become. Jesus is more than just that. Rather than share the answers that I got, I prefer to encourage you to consider my reflections in the hope that you might test the validity, or otherwise, of the tenets that you currently hold. I will say, however, that all my reflections have suggested to me that all that I once thought of as supernatural is actually a wonderful, if mystical, natural process that invites collaboration with everyday folk, like you and me. Well, that's all been a long-winded way for me to come to a conclusion that our next evolutionary step could be enhanced, albeit not so simply, by shifting our focus from our dependence on the God that we visit and who visits us to collaboration with the mind of God within which we are nested. The Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran has captured the essence of my conclusion with a simplicity that is profound. When you love, you should not say, God is in my heart, but rather, I am in the heart of God. Love is not a dualistic visitor, but rather it resides in monistic reality, as do we. For me, this transfiguring shift in perspective has signalled a new kind of beginning, not with a mighty bang as it all started, but with empowerment to live with more loving intent. I now know that possibilities intentionally envisaged in love are the wellspring of miracles. So thank you for your willingness to partner my journey to here. I hope that some of my reflections may have triggered some of your own. Bye for now.